everyone, in this video I'll tell you everything that you can do to optimize the way you manage your time during the exam in order to maximize your performance and ultimately your marks. Before I delve into the strategies behind effective time management in exams, I want to preface by outlining a few assumptions that I've made while developing these strategies. These strategies are for students who want to achieve a Band 6 result for chemistry and physics. And being conservative with our alignment, to get a Band 6 result in chemistry and physics, let's just assume that we want to aim for a raw mark of 90 out of 100. This means we can allow us to lose up to a maximum of 10 marks. What I recommend is you give yourself 1 to 2 marks of potentially marks lost in the multiple choice section and 8 to 9 marks in the written response section. The other important assumption that I've made in this video is that you have done all your homework and revision and therefore covered all the necessary topics across the entire curriculum for chemistry and physics. So this video is not about how you can prepare for the exam, it's about how to effectively manage your time so that you can maximize your performance after you've prepared adequately for the exams themselves. Of course, before we delve into strategies, it's a good idea to familiarize ourselves with the actual structure of chemistry and physics exams. In the HSC, the total exam is 3 hours and 5 minutes. This consists of 5 minutes of reading time and 3 hours of writing time. I'll discuss each section separately later on in the video. The exam itself is out of 100 marks, which is composed of 2 sections. Section 1 is worth 20 marks and consists of 20 multiple choice questions worth 1 mark each. Section 2 is composed of the remaining 80 marks of the exam, and the number of questions in this section usually varies between 14 to 16. So this is usually designated question 21 to 34, 35, or 36. However, this can vary depending on the year of the exam. What's important for me to emphasize about the multiple choice section is that the questions are almost always arranged in increasing difficulties. So you can expect the first 5 to 10 questions to be very straightforward and very easy. And chances are you have come across most of these questions in your exam preparation when you're doing your past HSC exam papers. Section 2, which makes up 80 marks, will always contain at least 2 question items that's worth 7 to 9 marks. What a question item means is that this could be a question by itself with no parts within the question, and if that's the case, the maximum number of marks you can expect for a question will be 9 marks. You will never have a question by itself that's worth more than 9 marks. However, a question sometimes can contain multiple parts, for example, part A, part B, and part C. In these cases, an item refers to one of the parts of the question, and these parts can also worth up to 9 marks. If that's the case, then the entire question, because it also contains other parts and components, will be worth more than 9 marks. The fact that the exam itself will contain at least 2 of these items means that during reading time, you should at least spend some time to familiarize yourself with what topics these questions are usually examining. Therefore, you can have an idea and set yourself an expectation before writing time actually starts. Now, although reading time is only 5 minutes, using this precious time effectively can give yourself a very big advantage ahead of writing time. The first thing you should do is, of course, use 10 to 20 seconds and check you've got every single page of the exam paper and you have not missed any questions. When you're skimming through the exam paper to check for its completeness, what you should be also keep an eye out for is difficult and unfamiliar questions. Usually, you can identify these questions by simply looking at the diagram or stimulus that's provided along the text in the question. Instead of reading through the text, which usually could be quite long for these difficult questions, focus on the diagram. So this could include graphs, tables, or even structures of molecules in chemistry. These diagrams will usually give you an indication on what the topic of the question is examining, and also whether you've seen the question in the past. Using diagrams instead of reading through the text to identify these questions will save you a lot of time as well. When you're skimming through the exam paper, in addition to difficult and unfamiliar questions, you should also identify what other items or questions that are worth 7 to 9 marks. Oftentimes, there's an overlap because these questions are often the difficult and unfamiliar questions. Depending on the exam paper, these items could either be calculation or non-calculation based questions where you're simply asked to write theory or an analysis that does not require any calculations. My recommendation is that you focus on questions that do not require heavy calculation, because ultimately you can't use your calculator and also you cannot use a pen to jot down your ideas as you're going through calculation questions. For HSC chemistry specifically, I recommend spending your reading time to read through spectroscopy questions or anything related to the analysis of organic substances, as well as organic chemistry flowchart questions. The reason that I think focusing on these two types of questions is effective use of your time is because they don't require calculators, and oftentimes if your knowledge and understanding of these topics are robust, you can often solve the questions without using a pen before writing time even starts. For example, for spectroscopy questions, all you need to do is to read through the spectral data or any chemical test observations, and if you can put all of that together in your head before the writing time starts, you may be able to actually determine the structure of the compound without picking up the pen. For physics, it's a bit more variable. Questions that are worth 7 to 9 marks are usually based around analysis. These questions usually provide you with stimuli that you have to analyze and think about how they fit in to the topic or topics across the syllabus. So spending a minute or two during your reading time by reading through the question will give you a good idea on what topics you should be thinking about when it comes to writing time for these analyses questions. Now, let me give you some examples of what I meant by using the diagram instead of reading the text during reading time to get a good understanding of what the question is about. So for chemistry, here we have a table that shows you the volume of a particular chemical, and you've got 4 different volumes here. Hopefully you've seen something like this before, and the topic titration should jump to your mind because you've got 4 different volumes and 3 of them are quite similar, which is what you would expect in a titration. Now, from this table alone, we don't know anything else about this titration. We don't know if it's a precipitation titration. We don't know if it's an acid-base titration. But what we do know is we can expect some calculations and it will be a titration of some kind. For physics, if you see this diagram of 2 solenoids mounted on top of 2 carts or trolleys, this should prompt you to think about electromagnetism. Now, of course, the module of electromagnetism is quite broad, but you can eliminate a few topics that are very unlikely to be involved in this diagram. This diagram is, of course, not a motor. It's not a generator. And if you've seen questions about solenoids enough times during your preparation, this should prompt you to think of Faraday's and Lenz's law. So some kind of induction question. So the key takeaway here is by focusing the diagrams, the tables or graphs, as you're flipping through the exam pages, it should give you a rough idea of what the questions are about without having to read the question in detail by skimming through the text themselves. Now, ultimately, reading time is only 5 minutes. After you have gone through the exam paper, making sure your exam paper is complete, having identified and recognized what the difficult questions are, in the very last few seconds, you should turn to the beginning of the first section, the beginning of the multiple choice questions. Now, just to remind you, the multiple choice questions in the HSC exam are arranged in order of difficulty. So the first couple questions are usually very easy and straightforward. And these questions are so easy that you should be able to read them and do them in your head and remember the answers before the writing time even starts. Let me give you some examples. For chemistry, this is the first question of one of the recent exam papers. Which term is used to define the repeating unit of a polymer? The answer to this question should jump straight to you if you have covered this topic adequately during your preparation. This is an example from a physics paper in recent years. The absorption lines in a star spectrum is shown. What feature of the star is directly responsible for these absorption lines? Again, if you've covered this topic adequately during your preparation, the answer should be very obvious to you. So in the last 30 seconds of your reading time, you should be reading through these easy and straightforward multiple choice questions, remember the answers, and shading the bubbles as soon as writing time starts. This will mean you will have more time left over to spend on fewer number of questions in section 1. Now, many students ask me, what is the best order of tackling the exam? Should you do the multiple choice questions first? Really, the answer is depends, and it's really up to you and also the style of the exam paper on the day. So it's good to be aware of some of the pros and cons of doing the multiple choice questions first. The advantage of doing multiple choice questions first is that obviously you're doing the questions and the exam paper in the right order. It will give yourself a sense of organization, and as you complete the multiple choice question, you have obviously completed more questions in the entire paper compared to if you had done the multiple choice question after the written response question. For some students, doing the exam paper in the right chronological order can also be a good strategy to minimize the chance that you miss a question. If you're jumping back and forth between different questions, chances are you may miss a question, and maybe later on towards the end of the exam, and perhaps you'll only realize this towards the end of the exam when you've got less time available and therefore more pressure to secure as many marks as possible. So if you're one of those students, I do recommend that you do the multiple choice questions first before the written response questions, and just in general, do the exam paper in the order it's given in. Now, what are some disadvantages of doing the multiple choice question first? Well, for some students, time management during the first section may have been a problem in the past. If you're one of these people, you may have spent excessive amounts of time in the multiple choice question, which remember is only 20% of the entire paper. That leaves you with less than ideal time for the remaining 80% of the paper, so you might struggle a bit with time management down the road. Again, coming back to spending too much time on multiple choice questions, doing the written response section first may allow you to gain more marks simply because more marks are awarded to these questions compared to a question of the same caliber or difficulty in the multiple choice question section. Now let's talk about managing your time effectively when you're doing the multiple choice questions. The recommended time that you spend on the multiple choice question is 35 minutes. If you divide this time amongst 20 questions, this comes down to about 1 minute and 45 seconds per question. As I mentioned before, if you can do the first 2 or 3 questions before writing time even starts, this means you can spend the 35 minutes on the remaining 17 questions only. Now, because the questions are ranged from easy to more difficult questions towards the end of the section, you should spend roughly half the time, so 15 to 20 minutes, on the first 10 to 15 questions. The reason why I've given you a range here instead of a precise number is because the overall difficulty of the questions really depends on the exam paper. But of course, the more questions you can attempt in the first 20 minutes, the better off you will be when it comes to time left over for the rest of the exam. Once you've done the first 10 to 15 questions, then you can spend the remaining time out of the 35 minutes on the remaining 5 questions, which tend to be a lot more difficult compared to the first 15. For all questions in this section, particularly the last 5 questions and the ones that are more difficult, you should be approaching the question by asking yourself, can I do this question in the first 20 seconds of reading the question? In the first 20 seconds, as you're reading the question, whether this is looking at a diagram or reading the text of the question, you should be identifying and recognizing what topic or what part of the module or curriculum is this question on. If you cannot do this in the first 20 to 30 seconds of reading the question, my advice is that you skip the question, circle it, and return it later on if you have spare time towards the end of the exam. This is because if you don't know what topic it is in the first 20 seconds, keep in mind that you only allowed 1 minute and 45 seconds per question. Chances are you will need more time to reread the question in order to recognize the topic that the question is about. And again, this time does not include any working or further thinking that you need to arrive at your answer. And considering that one multiple choice question is only worth 1 mark, is it really worth to spend more than 3 or 4 minutes on one question if you don't really know what the question is about from the very beginning? So as a general piece of advice, guess the question and skip it. Return to the question afterwards if you think the question will take you longer than 2 minutes to figure out how to do it. The important part is to figure out how to do it. Not to do the question, but to gain enough understanding so that you're confident you can solve the question. If you can't reach this understanding within 2 minutes, skip the question. In order to confidently achieve a Band 6 result in chemistry and physics, in the multiple choice question, you should aim to attempt at least 17 out of 20 questions with confidence. When I say attempt the question with confidence, I mean that you have recognized the topic the question is about and that you're 100% confident that you've understood and interpreted the question correctly and subsequently have done the question correctly to arrive at your answer. By doing so, assuming you haven't made a silly mistake somewhere in your working out, then you should be gaining at least 17 out of 20 marks from this section. Let's talk about how to manage your time effectively in section 2, which are the written responses. This will make up the majority of your 3-hour writing time in the HSC Chemistry and Physics exam. Precisely, this should take you about 145 minutes or 2 hours and 25 minutes. Now, unfortunately, unlike the multiple choice questions, the written response questions in section 2 are not necessarily arranged in increasing levels of difficulty. You can expect the first few questions, that is 21, 22, 23, etc., to be straightforward, and chances are you may have come across these questions in your preparation. However, it does not mean that the last few questions towards the end of the exam are always the most difficult. Sometimes these difficult questions could be allocated within the middle of section 2. That being said, if you're tackling the exam in its given order, you should try to attempt most of the easy or common questions first in the first hour of the time you spend on these written questions. Most likely this will include question 21, 22, 23. After the first hour, you should have attempted at least half of the questions in section 2. After the first hour spent on section 2, you should be focusing on the difficult and unfamiliar questions that you previously identified during reading time. This could be the items that are worth 7 to 9 marks, or it could be questions that are worth fewer marks but that they seem to be difficult or unfamiliar to you when you read them. Again, I want to stress that these difficult and unfamiliar questions may not be at the end of the exam, which is again why it's very important for you to use the 5 minutes of reading time to gain a good overview of where these questions are throughout the exam paper. I recommend doing these questions now after the first hour because you want to avoid doing them towards the end of the exam, especially if these questions are the last few questions of the exam. So if you're doing them in the order they're prescribed, then chances are you'll be doing these more difficult questions in a time-pressured environment that you otherwise could have avoided. Having more time to do these questions also allows time for you to plan the question adequately so your responses, especially for the longer questions, is more concise and succinct. Now, because you're prioritizing these difficult and unfamiliar questions before some of the other easier ones, when you're doing these difficult questions, it's very important for you to keep in mind and just be aware of how many easier questions are still left unattempted. Now, sometimes when you're reading through these difficult and unfamiliar questions, you may not be able to reach a complete understanding or be fully satisfied with the response to these questions. In those cases, it will be more time efficient and wise in terms of your overall performance to do as much as you can for these difficult and unfamiliar questions and then jump back to the easier and more common questions to secure those marks first. Obviously, because they're easier and more common, you're more likely to secure full marks for these questions as opposed to spending more time on the difficult questions where you're not as confident in securing full marks. Let's summarize the general approach to section 2. After the multiple choice section, you should have around 2 hours and 30 minutes left. And in the first hour of attempting the written response questions, you should be focusing on the first few questions that are likely to be easy and more straightforward. After which you will have around 1 hour and 30 minutes left. So this is the halfway point of the entire 3-hour exam. At this point, you should have finished at least half of the questions in the written response section. So that's usually around 7 to 8 questions. Then you will be spending the next half an hour, for the very least, to attempt the more difficult and unfamiliar questions. And most of the time, these will include the items that are worth 7 to 9 marks. After half an hour, you should have about 1 hour left over. And this is where you will spend the next half an hour to finish off any unattempted easy questions. And this will leave you 30 minutes at the very end for spare time, which I'll talk about in a very moment. Although I've given you a very strict framework in terms of how much time to spend on each stage of section 2, you need to be also flexible with your time. The difficult questions may take longer or shorter than 30 minutes. If it takes longer than 30 minutes, that just means it's cutting into the time you spend on easy questions. This brings me back to the point. When you're attempting the difficult questions, you have to be conscious about how many easy questions are still unattempted. If you've got more questions unattempted, then it's probably a good idea to be more conservative with your time, meaning leaving more time towards the end of the exam to finish off the unattempted questions before returning to the difficult questions to finalize your answer. Conversely, if the difficult questions ended up taking shorter time than you expected, for example 20 minutes, then this means you can afford to spend more time finishing off the rest of section 2 and possibly giving yourself more spare time at the end of the exam to do the final touches and check your answers. Let's talk about what the best way to spend the spare time at the end of the exam is. Ideally, you should have around half an hour left at the end of the exam. This exam time is not just to check your answers. This is to finish off any unattempted multiple choice questions that you have left at the very beginning of the exam. This time is also used to do the final touches of any unfinished responses. And you should only spend time on these responses if you're confident that what you're about to add to the response can get you more marks. And finally, once you're happy with all of your questions and you've attempted all the questions, you should go back to your calculation questions, which you frequently have made mistakes during your preparation, and check your working to make sure you haven't made the same mistakes again, and to also check that your final answer has the right number of significant figures as well as units. For chemistry especially, it's a good idea to quickly check all your chemical equations to make sure they are balanced and have the right arrow, whether it's a reversible or a single direction reaction, and they have the right states as well. Hey everyone, if you found this video helpful, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Want even more? Become a Patreon member for early access to videos, exclusive Discord discussions about questions on chemistry and physics, and live preparation sessions for your exams. Don't forget to head over to our website for topic tests and practice exams to further improve your understanding and learning.